Here's your news from March 11th, 2020. We're kicking off today with news from NFL legend Rob Gronkowski, as the former New England Patriots star is reportedly close to signing with WWE. On the latest edition of WWE Backstage, Ryan Satin said that Gronk was in deep discussions with WWE and could be appearing as soon as next week's SmackDown on March 20th. Though details are still unclear about the former NFL star's relationship with WWE, the fact that the company feels comfortable enough to mention the negotiations is a huge sign that it may just be a matter of time before Gronkowski enters the ring. Fans may remember Gronk's appearance during the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal at WrestleMania 33, where he helped his real-life pal Mojo Rawley win the match. And it may just be a matter of time before Gronk and the former 24/7 champion share the ring again, either as partners or opponents. From one new face in wrestling to two veterans of the industry, as AJ Styles and The Undertaker are set to collide at WrestleMania 36. During his promo on this week's Raw, the Phenomenal One said that he will literally put the nail in The Undertaker's coffin, and went even further, claiming he would kill the dead man, and this is a word WWE usually leaves out of promos. On Wrestling Observer Radio, Brian Alvarez noted that Styles was seemingly hinting at having a casket match at WrestleMania, and Dave Meltzer agreed that it sounded very possible. Both Styles and The Undertaker will be at Raw next week to sign the contract that will make their match official, so it's entirely possible that the contract stipulation will be added then, 14 years after the last casket match to take place at a WrestleMania. We are looking ahead to this week's SmackDown now, and while the WWE has confirmed that Paige and Jeff Hardy will be returning to the show, there may be a third return as well. The PW Insider is reporting that Nia Jax has been medically cleared to return, and that the former Raw Women's Champion could be moved to the Blue brand very soon. They said, "The word making the rounds at Raw last night was that Nia would be part of the SmackDown brand when she returned, and that she would be at this week's TV taping. The fact that Jax will be backstage at SmackDown this week doesn't mean she'll be on TV, as Jeff Hardy was backstage at the Blue brand for the past 3 weeks and didn't appear, and neither did The Undertaker, who was backstage at Raw. Still, the fact that Jax will be backstage indicates that her return to the ring will be very soon, after the Irresistible Force has spent close to a year recovering from double knee surgery." From SmackDown to Raw now, as this week's show ended with a huge 8-man tag team match, but the contest didn't end without someone getting seriously hurt. During Wrestling Observer Live, Brian Alvarez noted that Rezar suffered a bicep injury during the match, saying, "It is believed that Rezar suffered a torn bicep. He is still being evaluated, but I didn't even see where it happened last night. But the last 5 minutes of the match, this guy can't even move his arm and he's doing spots. He's catching guys, and I was like, this is the toughest dude I ever saw." The timing of this injury could not be worse, as the AOP are finally getting back into the swing of things after Rezar's partner Akam suffered an injury himself. Hopefully this injury won't keep Rezar out of action for long, and with WrestleMania 36 drawing near, it'll be interesting to see what WWE has planned for Seth Rollins and his acolytes. We are once again looking at the recent medical crisis that is taking place around the world, and while WWE has no plans of calling off WrestleMania, the city of Tampa might have other plans. On Twitter, Ryan Bass reported that the mayor of Tampa, Jane Castor, will hold a meeting with others to discuss postponing or canceling major events to the crisis that has infected close to 120,000 worldwide. Given that WrestleMania is expected to bring in tens of thousands of people to the Tampa area, it's possible that Castor may postpone the show of shows, especially as there have been reports of infected people in the Tampa area. WWE superstars reportedly breathed a sigh of relief recently when the company instructed a no-touching rule due to the crisis. And the city of Tampa will make a decision about WrestleMania on Thursday in what may be the biggest change to the show of shows in its 36-year history. Back to SmackDown now, and though it's been several years since Paige last competed in the WWE, the former Divas champion has certainly been busy. Since her 2018 retirement, Paige has served as the general manager of the Blue brand, the manager for the Kabuki Warriors, and most recently as a contributor on WWE Backstage, though the British superstar may finally get the chance to wrestle again after all. On Raw this week, it was announced that Paige will be returning this Friday to confront SmackDown Women's Champion Bayley, and Reddit user Loose Lips Backstage, who had a history of getting things right, hinted that the anti-diva may be challenging for the gold at WrestleMania. Of course, Paige's health is the most important thing the WWE needs to consider if they choose to allow her to wrestle again, and though the backstage correspondent recently had emergency surgery, Paige has said she's all better now, meaning the possibility of her returning does seem more possible with every passing week. One person who knows all about having title matches at WrestleMania is Triple H, and while the game doesn't look to be having a match this year, he's been kept busy behind the scenes. This week, the 14-time world champion added another role to his list of responsibilities, as in a document sent to WWE shareholders, he was described as the Executive Vice President of Global Talent Strategy and Development, a role he has held since February. This is a change from his previous title of WWE Executive Vice President of Talent, Live Events and Creative, and it looks like the King of Kings is gaining more responsibility backstage, and it may not be long until Triple H and his wife Stephanie are running the entire WWE instead of his father-in-law Vince McMahon. We've got more news from WWE's corporate side, as the WWE recently axed their co-presidents Michelle Wilson and George Barrios, but the pair got a lot more than best wishes in their future endeavors. In the same document that confirmed Triple H's new role, it was also revealed that both Wilson and Barrios received $1.4 million each, along with a bonus of $176,000. Not only that, but the pair will also receive health, life, and accident insurance for the next 18 months, which is certainly a lot better than a "sorry you're leaving" greeting card. This huge severance package probably made it much easier for Barrios and Wilson to take the news of their sudden unemployment, and there's still no word of who will be replacing the pair in the long term. Back in the ring now, and at this year's WrestleMania, John Cena will have his first pay-per-view match in over a year when he takes on The Fiend. When Cena recently appeared on SmackDown, it seemed like the match wasn't going to happen, as the 16-time world champion said that he didn't want to be a part-timer taking the spot of a full-timer, but the match was still made for Cena vs. Wyatt 6 years after their last WrestleMania match. While speaking to Wrestling Inc., Mick Foley claimed he believes this will be John's final match, and gave his reasons for this, saying, "The Fiend is not someone who needs a title to define him. It's gonna be very interesting, and I think it adds another huge match, as John Cena gave an impassioned promo, and it leads me to believe that this will be his final match. I would not be surprised to see The Fiend come out of Mania stronger than ever." The WWE Hall of Famer went on to compare The Fiend to Roddy Piper, claiming that both men are big enough attractions that they don't require championship gold. It's certainly interesting that WrestleMania will take place in Tampa, a place John Cena has called home for years, and given that Cena defeated the old Bray Wyatt at WrestleMania 30, their story could come full circle with The Fiend retiring Big Match John this year in Tampa, Florida. Speaking of WrestleMania, this year will also reportedly see Edge return to the ring to face Randy Orton in what has become a very personal feud between the two. After attacking the Rated R superstar on the Raw after his shocking Royal Rumble return, Orton also RKO'd Edge's wife and fellow Hall of Famer Beth Phoenix recently on Raw, prompting the Ultimate Opportunist to get some revenge on the Viper this week. In a tweet by the Glamazon, Phoenix simply said "run" and tagged Orton in the tweet, as she's clearly happy to see her husband deliver a beatdown to the Viper. It's not clear whether Beth herself will have a match at WrestleMania, but whether she does or not, fans can expect her to be cheering on her husband in his first match at the biggest show of the year in 9 long years. We've got more news concerning Orton now, as the WWE is all about making money and therefore have plenty of trademarks to their name. This week, the company filed more trademarks for their top superstars, and this list included both Orton and The Undertaker, according to PW Insider. According to their report, the WWE filed copyrights for the terms Apex Predator, The Deadman, and The Phenom. All of these trademarks will allow WWE to use the terms in the ring and for merchandising purposes. Given the storyline with Edge and Beth Phoenix, this copyright is probably the last thing on Orton's mind, but the Apex Predator could show up for WrestleMania to battle the 11-time WWE World Champion with a brand new shirt. Speaking of Hall of Famers, one man who should be inducted is Owen Hart, as the legacy of the talented star who was taken far too soon is still being felt today. It's hardly surprising that everyone who encountered Owen has a good story about him, and on Twitter this week, Matt Hardy shared his opinion on him after being asked about the Rocket. He said, Owen was a great guy and an absolutely amazing performer. He was always kind and willing to help, teach, and work with my brother and I. Owen Hart was one of the best ever. We can only wonder what Owen would be doing nowadays if he had not tragically died at the Over the Edge 1999 pay-per-view. But we can't help but think that someone as skilled, funny, and clever as The Rocket could have been a fantastic trainer in NXT. And finally today we're ending with some news from another member of the Hart family, as Bret Hart has never shied away from giving his opinions on wrestling. During a recent social media live session, the Hitman was asked what he thinks about Hulk Hogan and didn't mince his words at all, saying, "Do I like Hulk Hogan? No, I don't. I think he's a phony piece of shit." Despite being arguably the biggest name in wrestling, Hogan isn't exactly the most popular person in the industry, as years of backstage politicking, including avoiding losing the WWF title to Bret in 1993, has made the Hulkster a polarizing figure. In December last year, CM Punk took shots at the Hulkster, saying, "I've met him, and I like him even less now," as it certainly doesn't seem likely that Hogan will be sharing a limousine with either the excellence of execution or the best in the world anytime soon.